Big welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time to join this webinar brought to you by Elemental, which is the online community for professionals focused on heat, water, air and energy. And today we have a fantastic panel that we've assembled for you, and we're going to be talking about retrofit in social housing. So recently the UK Chancellor's announced a £50 million social housing retrofit program, but a recent study has shown it's actually, we're not too sure where to start. Not everyone's very clear on it. So what we're going to do here today is look at the retrofit picture. We're going to introduce our panel of experts in a moment to discuss what perhaps some of the roadblocks might be, and see also how retrofit in social housing, how does that fit into the bigger picture of the UK's ambition to get to net zero in 2050. So without much further ado, let me introduce some of our guests that we brought together today. So we have George Sims, who is Senior Project Manager at Energy Catapult. We have Andrew Parkin, who is the Chairman of PEPA, which is Property Energy Professionals Association. Martin Jervis, Chief Commercial and Operating Officer at QBot. Phil Mason, who is the Head of Regulatory Engagement at Trustmark, and Andy Mace, Director at Arup. So a brilliant collection of expertise that we've gathered here today, and they're here not only to provide their perspectives, but also to answer some of your questions. So do please ask your questions. There's a Q&A button, hopefully, just down on the toolbar as you're watching this webinar, so feel free to submit your questions at any time through that. You pose them, I'll ask them, and hopefully these experts will answer them. And as we go, we'll dive into some of those questions. But for now, maybe I can start with George, and let's just start with a bit of context. You know, how do we see social housing and retrofit in social housing? What's maybe different about social housing compared to some of the other sectors?
Thanks, Ben. I would say that one of the sort of good things about social housing is that there's a long-term ownership model, and I think that when we're looking at retrofit plans that could take several years to do in a phased manner, that makes a lot of sense. And social landlords are organisations that are already doing a lot of maintenance work, planned maintenance, looking after their properties, and have the ability and the resources to be able to plan investment in a way that perhaps most ordinary householders won't be able to do. And also, a lot of people will be in their homes for 2 or 3 years, move out, and the ownership will change. I think the flip side to that is that you have a landlord and a tenant, and there's a split incentive, which we probably all know about, whereby where the landlord invests, the tenant might reap the savings. And so I think there's a need to develop new business models and understand better the benefits that come out of retrofit, which might include lower maintenance costs over time, to feed into that long-term planning process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, George. I'll bring Martin into the conversation on this as well. Hi, Martin.
Hi there. Thanks, Bill. And building on what George said, and I completely agree with all of that. I think there are almost the 3 F's in social housing. They have the focus for the reasons that were just explained. They also are interested in addressing fuel poverty, even through the split incentives. And finally, there is funding increasingly available to stimulate this particular sector, which is useful. On the other hand, the challenge that we have, as in part because of that split, is actually getting access into people's residence homes, actually doing the bookings and getting access to do surveys and work can be really, really challenging. And that's not just for retrofit, that's common across the sector. So for anybody providing services. So there is a challenge there in terms of the efficiency of the model in the sector, but by and large, lots of good stimulants.
Yeah, okay, so some kind of unique aspects to it, but maybe we could take a look at sort of the bigger picture and work out, you know, its importance and how it fits into perhaps the overall net zero ambitions. And maybe I'll ask Andrew to Andrew to come in on this one.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think there are all sorts of sort of challenges, and there are all sorts of benefits to focusing on social housing. I think it's a very, very important sector. I will probably cover a lot of those further down when we're talking. I think where social housing differs is as has been said previously by Martin, it's that sort of engagement with the tenant, the tenancy. You have a range of tenants, some of which will be naturally engaged, and some of which are not going to be engaged at all. Some of which understand their properties, and some of which don't. And I think one of the key things really to sort of getting into and understanding and making progress in social housing is that education piece around how the tenants are using their properties and what their understanding is typically of those properties. They're also better performing in general compared to other sectors. And I think there's this sort of, there's this strategy piece that has to come along fairly quickly, but may evolve over time. So a social housing provider has got a housing stock that's fairly typical. At what point are they going to move to the new technologies? When are they going to adopt potentially hydrogen or air source or ground source heat pumps, or are they going to go for a more sort of heat network approach? And I think those decisions are coming down the line sort of fairly quickly, and the time scales are sort of important as well. Do they look at the next 10 years and stick with gas? Do they break that model at some point in the next 10 years? So I think the strategy is going to be really key. Because
I think we were talking about maybe some of the low-hanging fruit has perhaps been already addressed in perhaps a lot of social housing, maybe because of the reasons, because we have people, it's easier to perhaps get into these properties. So before we just get on to too many of the challenges, I do want to bring in Phil and Andy as well, sort of into the conversation. Sort of Phil, how do you see this playing out? What's your kind of perspective on this as well at the moment?
Okay, I mean, I think in terms of social housing, there's a slightly different model to the rest of the sort of housing sector generally. I mean, one thing we've got to remember is that social housing is or by my understanding anyway, is certainly around 20% of the national housing stock. So that's a really big sector that sits under sort of various tiers of sort of management where things are together. There's something that from previous lives I've had involvement with, and that's sort of tenants and resident sort of associations and liaison sort of meetings and groups. And I think in terms of getting buy-in from occupants, there's a really good way of doing that. There is to present some really good examples of things that have gone well. I think they've got to be really realistic, because there is a little bit of upheaval when you're having retrofit going on. There's a little bit of inconvenience. There is the inevitable dust and noise that goes with it, but the long-term gains, or sort of in my personal experience, are well worth it. And I think there's an opportunity to start channeling buy-in and people's expectations and understandings in sort of wider groups that really help the movement go along. Because if you can get sort of occupant buy-in and acceptance, actually you instead of just having a push model where the landlord wants to drive the improvement, you get tenants actually starting to say, well, we like a bit of that because we understand the benefit, we understand the comfort that it brings us, and we understand the cost savings that it can bring us as well.
Absolutely. That sounds promising. So what are some of the real barriers? Obviously that maybe engagement is one, but Andy, let me throw that to you, and then we'll open it up to some of the others on the panel here. But the real barriers that we kind of need to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean the guys before me have spoken about many of them. I'm in danger of maybe repeating, but funding is clearly a challenge. And perhaps some direction of that into what are perceived as more pressing issues around fire safety and other things, which are obviously very front of mind. But that said, there's work going on by the Green Finance Initiative and others around new funding models and bringing forward demonstrators. So there are challenges, but work is being done to address them around funding, which is great. And I think some of this is then about aggregating those ideas together rather than each of us in our own sort of sectors thinking we're working unilaterally, chipping away. So more integration I think is key. The guys have spoken about the very personal and raw nature of retrofit. Even before we were coming on the call, we were all talking about our own experiences, and that is a very real thing. So it is everything from funding through to people's personal experience, as well as horror stories from the past. And there is a lot of legacy issues here I think we've got to get over. So quality of materials, quality of workmanship, trust in people, these are all things that need a concerted effort on, I think, to sort of create the sort of the space and the confidence for people to take it forward as we need to, given the net zero targets that we face.
Yeah, I mean, would anyone like to build on that? Is there sort of a priority focus here? Is there some sort of tips, I suppose, for people listening as well?
Okay, one of the things that we're fairly close to is Trustmark, and for perhaps anybody that doesn't, anybody sort of watching or listening to us that doesn't perhaps have an overly great understanding of Trustmark, is we're a registration scheme. We operate through scheme operators to register competent businesses to be able to do the work. And there's been a big, I mean, we're quite a broad church, but there's been a real drive since it's going into the eco regulations in around our operations and around the energy sector. And one of the things that's becoming really fairly apparent is the capacity of the supply chains. So I think we've got some really good technologies out there now that are well established. They're well tried and tested. Those technologies will almost definitely go through further iterations, and there'll be technologies that we've not yet thought of that come out. So technology is one stream. The actual materials in terms of fabric materials, but again, it sort of echoes the same story. We've got some really good stuff there so far, and technologies and material science continues to change. So we'll see involvement there, but we've got a supply chain that, in order that where I think there's a wider concern in terms of a supply chain, we've got to make sure that we've got not only a large enough supply chain, the capability of supply chain to deliver. And I think we've seen a few recent examples where the supply chain isn't as substantial as it could be. And I don't think that's fault or blame. I think that's more about a sort of more unified national policy of bringing people into the sector. But one of the things I think we've got to really be concerned about as we move forward, if we've got sort of, it's not a term I particularly like, but if we got sort of Project UK to retrofit, what I really don't think we can do is afford to be a couple of million houses down the road and find out that the quality is not right. So there's a number of things going on in the background that some of us as the panel will be particularly close to. And some of you listening and having a watch of what's going on here will understand about PAS 2035 and all those things, and you either like it or you love PAS 2035, which is a bit of perhaps a marginally flippant approach, because it does represent significant steps change, but there's some really good principles and philosophies built into that approach that's been created by an industry-wide panel to bring it together. It's not the influence of any one sector or any individuals or any individual organisations, but I just don't think we can afford to get, I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, don't afford to get several million properties down the line and then suddenly think, hang on, the quality's not right here, because several million properties are retrofit to remediate is a devil of a lot of unpicking. So we've got to get a substantial, capable supply chain that's actually really bought into delivering the quality behind it. I think it's an absolute key strand of what's got to be achieved going forward. It's a big challenge as well, I think.
Yeah. And Andrew, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, Phil. We've got to be able to do this in the right way with the right quality. We've got to be able to do it at scale as well, and they sometimes compete with each other. So we've got to be able to deliver quality, the right measures in the right scale. Obviously, bringing in economies of scale, make things a bit cheaper and a bit easier things to be done. But I think there's other parts to this as well. We need to start incorporating or bringing in innovative technologies, and we need a model to allow that to happen. I think that's being explored through Eco at the moment, but I see there being a huge opportunity for innovative technologies within social housing as almost like a test bed. Think of it as almost like the world of Formula One is where you get the technology right in motor racing, and you want to then release it out to the wider market. I suppose there's a sort of a similar sort of concept going on here. I think there are dangers though from sort of competing theories or theologies out there as well. Something that we need to be aware of. I'm very much into retrofit. I think you have to have a national retrofit strategy in place. But there is a competing theory saying, well, why are we looking to retrofit all these properties? Why can't we just produce electricity and just change everybody over to electric boiler of some kind, or electric heat generation, and that will sort the problem out of removing fossil fuels and reducing carbon emissions? And it's not that simple. And I think we need to have those conversations, and we need to discuss those in detail. And I think it does equally apply to social housing, because those considerations are probably going on right now. You have to get properties to perform more efficiently. And there are benefits from that as well, being able to make properties healthier to live in. So I think that's a barrier. It's almost like a mental barrier as much as anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on barriers still, Andy, do you want to chime in here? Yeah, Andy, do you want to start again with your point? So you're on mute.
Sorry, Ben. Yeah, I think even the language we use, we've got to be really careful with, because this is absolutely, there is a need to engage, people, everyone. We are all in homes, and the Committee on Climate Change has been very clear on the fact that 29 million homes in the UK need, some sort of energy efficient retrofit. So we need all of us to be engaged and creating that pull for retrofit. And even that word is quite technical, is not that clear to people who are not working, in this sort of area about what it means. So there is something about how we engage with everyone about this issue in different ways, and around the value to them of thinking about their homes and their energy bills, and even health, and all the other benefits that what we call retrofit would bring them. So there is more to be done there, I think. And you looking at it through a health lens, in language and around issues that people understand, because this is what is affecting them in their daily lives, and then following that thread to what the technical answer might be in their homes around improving insulation and etc. I think we've got a long way to go, and it's a really important avenue to explore.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to move the conversation on a little bit now, and it also plays to one of the first questions that we've got from the audience here from Florence, which is talking about asking for some examples, and if we can name any, then ask our panel if we can. But we asked sort of what examples do we have, whether it's in the UK or further afield, but of what good social housing retrofit really looks like. Who's sort of worked on any? Maybe George, would you like to share your example?
The obvious ones, Nottingham City Homes and what they've done with Energy Strong. I think in terms of the benefits for the tenants, they've been very well documented. Quality of life and internal environment in those homes is significantly better. There's also been a number of improvements that have helped improve tenants' lives. So some of the things that really made a difference to that project in terms of getting tenant acceptance were things like outdoor taps. Another one, because of the slightly weird configuration of those homes where you have a doorbell both at the front and the back, different doorbell tones for the front and the back door. That was another thing that it's a really small thing, but in terms of making it more acceptable and improving people's quality of life, because it meant that you knew which door to go to when the doorbell went. So that's a fantastic example of tenant engagement, and I think what they're doing in Nottingham, as I understand with the programme now, is looking at how they can adapt that Energy-sprung model to reach more homes, to perhaps have a bit more of a balance between low carbon heat and building fabric improvements, and look at scaling that up. So that will be my first point of call. Emily Brain there, is really approachable, really knowledgeable, and excellent person to speak to.
Brilliant, thanks, George. I hope that helps you there. Florence, I don't know if Andy or if anyone else wants to share any examples with this.
Briefly, I mean, some work we did a while ago. So, you know, the total, this George was alluding to it there, but the sort of the total value that retrofit brings, and there's some work I'm certainly aware of from a few years back, where we looked at the sort of total return on investment of a social housing organisation, and it looked as broadly as we could. You know, not energy bills, you know, is part of it, obviously, but you know, the return on investment in terms of improved health outcomes, improving local, you know, putting money into the local economy and the supply chain. You know, there's a range of things that we could monetize, and it's quite amazing, you know, the multiplier effect of a pound spent. Please don't ask me what the multiplier was, but as I recall, it was pretty high in terms of the total value comes back from a pound.
Okay, yeah, and that's important. Go on, Martin. Did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say I think there's a lot of stories of which obviously get spread quite quickly, of bad retrofit experiences, and everybody can hook on to why those are bad experiences. I think for good retrofit, it depends what you're looking at. We're working very closely with Emily in Nottingham. We're working with Energy-sprung, but they've got a few projects, so I don't know if it's necessarily the same one that George is talking about. But for example, we're trying to do two things in the same project there. We're trying to have a very, very tight control on the measures that it's understood need to go into every house, which is external wall insulation and underfloor insulation through us if they have a suspended floor, which is great. And that is effectively in a contractual, tightly constrained environment. But because of all the learnings we need to have, you've got a completely different DNA in the other side of the project, which is about how we dramatically take costs out of it, how we think of smarter, better ways, create an environment where we can actually innovate almost on the job, and also work in that collaborative sense together. And therefore, bits of that will be good and bits of it will be bad, depending on what you were looking to get out of it. But there are two different concurrent DNAs in the project. And I think that can be very challenging for a social landlord to manage, and challenging for everybody in the ecosystem, because these two drivers behave in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't know if any of our panel have an opinion they want to share on that, but certainly another big challenge that we've heard about, and as a comment and a question from Stephen just coming in here about sort of cost, and about yes, there might be some wonderful potential things we can potentially do technically to retrofit properties, but equally sort of some of the practicalities, like how do we really ensure that older properties, particularly with flooring insulation and the cost of that it really doesn't become perhaps too significant. Who'd like to jump in? I don't know, Andrew, if you'd like to start us off with this.
Yes and no. It is the elephant in the room, isn't it, really? We're going to do a lot of work to properties over a relatively short period of time. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to require a lot of investment. And I could probably talk or waffle on, as it would turn out to be, for many minutes, if not an hour, on this subject. And I'm not sure I'm best placed to answer all of the questions either. There is a question in the chat from Wayne as well, I've seen, around which do you do first, and if you do it in a certain order, does it not have some unintended consequences later on, particularly around the cost of running the property? I think it's about, going back to the point, is having an overarching strategy of what we do first, and then having the ability to do it on a sort of a smaller scale level. where we know there's going to be some impacts on buildings or you know, groups of buildings. I think it comes back down to we have decided, I think, as an industry, that fabric first is the right approach, and it doesn't really matter how you heat the property or heat the hot water or, you know, light the place. If you've got the fabric working correctly, you know, and it's not producing any problems, you know, around condensation or damp, then that's the right place to be, and then we can start making decisions based upon that starting point. But until we get there, everything else seems a little bit academic. So that's kind of one of my main points I wanted to make a little bit earlier, but I sort of shoehorned it in here. There is a huge cost for a lot of properties in that area as well, and there are a lot of technical considerations around, as I say, condensation, damp, mold, and ventilation, and that's more cost associated with that. So I think getting that right is key. Once you've got the fabric right, once it's ready for renewables, to coin a phrase, we can start making decisions and looking at the technologies that are most suitable at that moment in time, or, you know, in the near future. I think that's all I'm going to say about that for now.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew. George, did you want to chip in on that?
Cost question obviously comes up because it's a, you know, major consideration. So I suppose on projects like Energiesprong, they're demonstrators, and the hope is that over time those costs will come down. But there's two sides to it, aren't there? In order for a project to be viable, you can either reduce costs or you can increase benefits and revenues. And I think not enough has maybe been done to look at that side of things, on where the sort of benefits and revenues might be. There's a bit of work done years ago by Sustainable Homes, and another similar one by the GLA, looking at the link between poor energy performance and increased housing management costs. So these are things like repairs, complaints, even rent arrears, customer contacts, voids, those sorts of things. So I think, you know, there's some more work to be done around the business case for retrofit in those areas. The other side of it is, well, if one of your objectives is to make sure you've got low fuel bills for tenants, and that theoretically means you have to put a lot of building fabric improvements in place, I'd argue that with some of the new sorts of business models built around flexibility, demand side aggregation that are coming through, that might allow you to not go quite as far with building fabric, and with a heat pump, storage, PV, still provide low cost energy to tenants, and a lower overall capital cost. So I think it's worth looking at models like those that Sarah Homes, for example, in Wales are developing, where they're able to achieve lower heating costs, lower, you know, price per kilowatt hour of electricity to supply their heat pumps by demand shifting and those sorts of things, which might mean in some cases that you don't need to go quite as far with building fabric.
Just a quick clarification on a point from someone, from Gillian. When you say demand side aggregation,
well, basically, electricity can cost more or less at different times, and so if you're able to go to when there's more demand on the electricity network, the distribution network operator, that's your regional electricity network, has higher costs of using that network. So if you're able to shift demand to use electricity at a different time, then you can incur lower costs, or there's a benefit to that electricity network that they might be prepared to pay you for. So basically, by turning down demand, shifting it to another time, there's a revenue saving to be had there. That's basically what it is.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Andy, you wanted to come in again?
Yeah, just to sort of broadening it out briefly, you know, that the energy efficiency and housing retrofit, this is a national infrastructure, you know, challenge, and it feels to me, you know, often organisations, whether it's RSLs or, you know, others, sort of feel that the whole of the elephant is theirs to, you know, theirs to eat kind of thing, and it's all stacked against them. But you know, at the moment there is so much work going on around this concept of local area energy planning and thinking about how sort of cities and regions need to decarbonize, that I think there's a real role here for social housing to play, both in provision of data to support that kind of work, and also for the reasons that everyone has spoken about earlier. In the importance of being able to do things because of the type of tenure. Those plans are taking time, and it's working at different speeds in the different parts of the UK. But those plans are getting into the detailed evidence of house by house what are the issues, and building up a picture to provide to support much more evidence-based decision making. And what it's also then starting to identify is where the number of buildings and where they are that have multiple ownership, or where households may or that the homes might be an issue, and part of the home itself, and the energy efficiency may be a factor in build poverty. So with that evidence becoming much more granular, that's starting to identify where policy needs to change, where much more targeted funding packages may need to be brought to bear. So I guess I'm saying there is hope. The fabric first point is always important, but the changing from gas to electric, or what have you, over the horizon soon, those wider plans about what is the right thing to do with your energy system, hopefully is coming.
Yeah, and you make the point. I want to just go quickly round the group and just get one final sort of a key message, and ask them perhaps for their one wish, if they had a magic wand that they could wave at the social housing sort of sector to help us on this journey towards net zero. And I might sort of start with Martin just before we go into. We've already got quite a few questions coming in from the audience, so I want to just make sure we get enough time to start answering a bunch of those. And if you've got other questions, please do keep adding them to the Q&A feature. So Martin, what about? Could I start with you?
Yes, of course you can. Well, to save time, I haven't got two things, just one. And for me, it goes back to an earlier theme. My wish is simply for the supply chain to be supported and mobilised. And a wish is no use unless it's to people who can do something about it. I think social housing is very well positioned to do that. They have their own direct labour organisations in many cases, and we've started discussions with many of them. Some are operating already, but they also have the mission to engage with the community and create jobs, and you could generate revenue from other projects. So there's a big opportunity for social housing to actually grasp hold of this and help solve what to me is the biggest problem, particularly with an innovation. It's getting what is typically a capricious supply chain to get engaged and behind it. And we actually have the power in our sector to control a little bit more of that than other people do. So that's my wish.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Phil, sort of nodding approval at that. Has he taken your point? Or
supply chain is a really big issue for me. I think I've already said, so at the risk of repeating myself there, but it's about supply chain, and it's also, to me, which is quite a big thing, because I've seen the consequences of not just single properties, but mass properties in projects, of not doing things in the right order and losing efficiency. Now sometimes doing things in the right order does present it, per property type represents its own challenge, but I see numerous examples, and some of which are all fairly close to home, that getting things done in the right order prevents detriment of damage, and it also prevents detriment of some of the really obvious things that thousands of pounds can be spent on the installation of measures, but they might need remediation when other measures go in. And in some situations, as the property takes its pathway forward, the original measures might not necessarily still be the right ones. So it's very, very, very fundamental. So for me, it's supply chain and order of the improvements.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Andrew, would you go next?
I think in terms of a wish, if I could have one wish, it's not really aimed at the sector per se. It's aimed at government, and that is that we have a sort of a unified, clear strategy that doesn't change from one parliament to the next. And we can have an environment where energy efficiency is and improving buildings is one or two on the priority list, and it doesn't change unless something needs to change, and governments don't come in and rip it up and start again because they know better. I think that would give us favourable conditions to actually achieve what we want to achieve. So that's my wish, and that goes across everything. I think the real benefits for what we're trying to achieve here is health benefits for the many, and removing as many people from fuel poverty. That really is what gets me up in the morning, so to speak.
Yeah, no, vitally important aspects. Thanks, Andrew. George, and then I'll come to you, Andy.
I've got a massive long wish list, and I know we're only allowed one, but given I've had a difficult morning and I haven't managed to have my breakfast yet, I'm going to be cheeky and have two. So first thing is building passports. I think if we had a proper plan for every building, setting out whole house plan, investment plan for the next 30 years, that would really transform the way that we can approach social housing retrofit based on detailed information. I think there's some great work that's been done with the Welsh School of Architecture. The Welsh Government's optimised retrofit programme as well is trying to look at developing those sort of building passporting approaches, but building passporting would be the first thing. And then the second thing to really help speed up process and really inform the detail, help the supply chain, is a library of retrofit details, method statements, sequencing things, which we have already, but it's only in a sort of very small form at the moment. There's a fantastic website, go and look at it. It's retrofit.support, being set up by University of Salford and Red Co-op in Manchester, and it's an open access source of construction details for retrofit. It's fantastic, but we need lots more of that.
Right, thanks, George. I'll let you off with your second one there. Andy, how about you? Always tough to go last in this sort of thing.
Very briefly, my wish is around people, and the need to engage everyone much more in this to create the market pull and demand. So talking to people about the issues that are important to them, that then hopefully will lead to the technical answer for retrofit in their homes, but coming at this from a much more humanistic perspective and engagement with people to create scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thanks, Vanessa. Now we're going to turn to lots of questions coming in. So let's see how many we can get through in the next 20 minutes or so. I will sort of start at the top and work our way down. But Ian Morris, and I'll just try and summarise the question for the audience, and then ask our panel to chip in with a quick answer. But I think, Ian, building on the idea that social housing should be a testbed for innovative technology, or potential testbed for innovative technology, but obviously against finance constraints, can't afford to fail. So how do you overcome risk aversion, perhaps, in this area? It's a tricky one. Who wants to go? George?
Well, well, a lot of risk comes out of uncertainty, doesn't it? And that kind of goes back to my point about data and building passporting and really good quality survey information. As we were talking about before this, there's always the sort of horror factor when you start doing opening up work and find loads of stuff that you hope wouldn't be there but is. But I think there's lots of surveying techniques that we can use now. I think combining things like air tightness testing with infrared, drone survey, even for certain sorts of buildings. There's some fantastic technology options out there for surveying now, and building up a detailed picture of a building helps to reduce the risk and give you more confidence about costs, but also reduces that fear factor. Yeah,
and George, just while we've got you on the mic there, could you just repeat the website you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, of course. It's retrofit.support.
Retrofit.support. We can put a link in the chat in a moment or so. Great, thanks for that. Oliver Rothwell is asking about sort of best examples of successful cross-tenure retrofit approaches. I don't know if we touched on that before, if that's an additional sort of nuance that we would like to comment on. Andy,
Yeah, I not in sort of detail at building level, I'm afraid, but for me personally, but going back to what I was saying earlier about work going on to identify where those buildings are, and that's, you know, tenure across buildings that may have residential, commercial, you know, retail, and the problem gets really knotty. So I think certainly the work we've been doing with the British government, that is absolutely recognised as a key issue, but it's at the moment we're in building the evidence stage, so to break down the problem so they can work out where they need to intervene, as I said, in terms of funding and policy change, etc.
Okay.
Sorry, a bit of a half answer.
That's okay. Does anyone else want to chip in on that, or should we?
I have a feeling that the retrofit work on the Thamesmead estate, Peabody's Thamesmead estate in south east London, had quite a lot of mixed tenure, and that was also a good example of tenant engagement as well. And actually, it's the tenant engagement and a lot of the survey work led them to take an approach which wasn't so fabric heavy, but got some really great outcomes for the occupants there.
Okay, thanks, George. I think we've certainly touched upon the point that Stephen Batty is making next, which was around his film being a good example of retrofit, but came across a cost of circa 75k per property. And any idea of how the level of retrofit required will or sort of can be paid for, and also how will this happen in the private market? I mean, does this kind of come down to questions around funding and government support and programs for it, or more around the point I think, George, you made around like considering the benefits, maybe taking a longer term approach? Anyone want to comment on this? I know we've talked about funding quite a bit, so maybe I'll move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I can't give detail right now, but so I think I mentioned earlier the Green Finance Institute and the work they've been doing. They've established this, let me get the acronym, Coalition for Energy Efficiency in Buildings. I think it is CEB, who are doing a lot of work around funding mechanisms and new ways of doing this. So I'm kind of pointing again at somewhere else to look at, but I think different ways of funding this are coming, but I think the challenges of passing on costs to customers is well understood. So yeah, again, half an answer, but stuff coming.
Thanks, Andy. George, yeah.
I think it's interesting. So I spoke to a landlord in Scotland a while back, and their perspective on this was really interesting. That we talk about getting the right balance between low carbon tech and building fabric and reducing cost and all that sort of thing. They'd taken a really long-term approach on it, and they worked out that, well, fuel poverty was absolute priority for their tenants. They've got loads of low-income tenants, and this was causing them loads of maintenance issues. So the best approach for them was Retrofit, which is deep building fabric retrofit, because it made sense for their tenants, and actually it made sense for their overall business plan. That's a sort of really good example of an organisation. This is Renfrewshire Council taking a long-term approach and looking at all the costs and benefits and building the case for investment based on that. It's not what you do in every sense. I'm not saying everyone should do Retrofit, and it will depend on your stock and depend on your tenants as well, and the profile of your tenant group. But they looked at all of the considerations, decided that was the way to go. So that was a great example, I think, of business planning.
Okay, thanks for that. Another just a question from Kirsty about can you share any payback models for landlords where tenants share the energy cost savings, for instance, because it perhaps also links to the next question, so I'll try and maybe wrap it into two. Can we talk a bit more about the health benefits to tenants, and is that actually even a plus for landlords? Obviously in a bit of a, I don't know, a very sort of economically rational way, perhaps more than a humanistic approach, but there is clearly a split kind of, benefits for tenants don't necessarily translate into the person who might have to pay for the investment in the first place. So any ways around that we're seeing?
Shall I start talking? That might give some time for other people to think about it.
Yeah, I think George is also as well, but yeah, Andy and George seems to be towards you guys. Yeah.
I mean, so many things interlinked here. So blindingly obvious around fire safety, and often the cost of that can be so overwhelming that energy retrofit is just completely secondary, because fire and health and safety dominates all. But the challenges that people are having in their homes because they are poorly insulated, and combined with other factors, leads to a household in fuel poverty, can often be in some parts of the country the same households that are struggling with health issues because of overheating, so because of poor insulation and glazing. So the retrofit for me is not just about energy efficiency. There are other issues here that if we're going to go into somebody's home, it's kind of what Phil was saying. You want to do it once and get the right sequence of things done to tackle everything. And I'm not an expert in this, but it seems to be health is such a foundation for so many other things, and air quality, overeating, underheating, all of those things impact on people's health and well-being. So whether that's helping to Susan's
Andy.
question. But
George, did you want to just chip in on top of that? George, yeah, you might have to start again. You're still mute there, George.
So sorry. The business model, an example that springs to mind, one where the benefits are shared between tenants and landlords, is the Reflex project up in Orkney with solar energy, where they're installing solar PV, battery, and other things. Tenants get the benefit of lower energy bills. Obviously, the landlords get the benefits of moving their homes closer towards net zero. So that's a good example of that sort of business model. On health benefits, yeah, I think landlords absolutely do care, not least because an environment that's going to be unhealthy to live in is often going to be one that is a home that's in poor condition as well. So if you look after the condition of your buildings, particularly with ventilation, then you'll also look after your tenants. And going back to that Peabody project I mentioned before in southeast London, the Thamesmead estate, the two major measures that they had in place there were a smart thermostat, switchy smart thermostat, which also had relative humidity sensors built into it. So they're providing better control to tenants, which is a plus for them, energy savings, but also they were monitoring relative humidity so they could see if there's any issues with damp, which are property issues, but they're also health issues. And then the other thing that they did was they installed ventilation. I think they might have used their ecosystem ventilation. So demand controlled ventilation, much better living environments. And that also protects the property because it means you don't get damp, mold growth, condensation, buildup of all those different things as well. So I think those are sort of a couple of good examples to answer those questions.
That's great. Thanks, George. Interesting question from Ian Morris. At what point can you decide not to retrofit, do you think? And is that what's that based on? So is it based on structure of the building or sort of total cost of retrofit against the cost of a new build? Anyone like to take that one? I'm not sure. Andy blowing your cheeks out there. I don't know if that's
also got to consider the carbon cost of a new building. So new building might be 50 tons of carbon or more. That's a huge sort of carbon burp. So the idea that we can sort of replace buildings with new, I think we kind of got to minimize that as much as possible and adapt what we have, because there's a huge amount of resources that need to go into that. Even with retrofitting, there's a lot of resources that will need to go into that, and a lot of carbon and embodied emissions associated with those sorts of things.
I don't think it's there'll be examples where it is possible, but I don't think you should be looking at buildings and going, well, we can't retrofit, let's rip it down and start again. I think there's an argument to say where you can't do retrofit, you look at other things that can be done to that building. I'm not sure what those things are without having a specific case in front of me, but you might not be able to do a full whole house retrofit on a building. There are still things you should do to that building. And there's the educational piece. How do you use energy? Reducing people's energy consumption in general. All of those things come from doing a more holistic approach to how people use their buildings and the retrofitting of those buildings. So I still think it's got application even in buildings that are hard to treat or difficult to upgrade.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that one?
Just briefly, I agree with both George and Andrew, but health and safety and fire trumps all, really. And we are seeing examples either structurally or from a fire perspective where the problems are so fundamental to the building that particularly for larger residential towers built several decades ago, that it is, notwithstanding George's point about carbon, completely agree. The whole circular economy disaster if we don't get this right. That has to trump things, and just the sheer cost of trying to fix major structural issues or fire safety issues can be so great that knockdown and rebuild is the cheaper way to go.
I think you've got a fair balance there, haven't you, Andy? It's it certainly shouldn't be the starting point, but it will be unavoidable in some cases.
Completely, yeah.
Okay, let's move on. We've got just a few minutes left, so we'll try and get through a few more. We've talked, I'm not sure whether Olivia Moore's question is about mixed tenure. I'm not sure if cross tenure, that's the same thing or a bit of a nuance, but how do you feel retrofit will work for tenants of social housing in estates or apartment blocks where there is mixed tenure? So i.e. Some people private rental, or now some people are owners because of the right to buy scheme. How do you imagine it will be if those in social housing receive retrofitting whilst their neighbours are sort of left on their own? Examples of that, or comment on that. Phil, did you want to?
Yeah, is there something that can be driven there by bringing communities of people and that in different tenureships together? Because whilst works are occurring, I mean, I suppose it's quite a sort of very basic example, really. But if exterior wall insulation is being put on a rental dwelling, and the one next door is in private tenureship, there's an economy of scale there. So that's just on the enabling works. There's economy of scale on the factory processes that are then able to be enabled. Purchasing costs, labour costs, everything. So it's not a panacea and it's not a fix-all. Don't profess that it is, but in bringing communities together and then understanding what the economies can be, and that can work all round. That can work for the tenants, that can work for the private property owners. It can actually work for the contractors as well. There's a balance there. So it won't be the same in every situation, because all dwellings will be different across sort of small geographical areas, and people's attitudes will vary. But there's a holistic approach to that, towards bringing people together to suggest projects where all can buy into it. And I know there'll be separate contracts that'll need to be arranged around it and all those sort of things that go with it. But I think there's an advantage of, it won't work everywhere, but there's advantages of economies of scale there. I very firmly believe that.
I have seen it happen, Phil, in South Wales, where the entire community, irrespective of tenancy or individual situation, sort of all got together as a community. There was community leaders involved, and people who were going to vouch for the project, and it almost, I say almost, to a house, they all had EWI applied. So it's kind of possible there. And then there's the whole EcoFlex thing within Eco, and I know that's been rolled out to varying degrees of success. I think there is an acceptance that there has to be this way forward, where you can't just say, well, we'll do it for that property and not that property. It just doesn't work if you allow that to happen.
Yeah. George, did you want to, or Martin, did you want to chip in as well? Do you agree?
Major degree of difference between difficulty of doing multi-tenure with houses and with flats. Flats are just so much more difficult, particularly if you're doing external works. Really challenging, but can be done and has been done. And I won't go too much into the details of that. The way it seems to often work with homes, and I think Phil's right, you do need to try and approach it at a community level. How it often seems to work is you consult tenants and freeholders, and you might get some of the freeholders along, and you'll get some that don't really want to do it. You do your retrofit, the freeholders see how great it looks, and then they say, actually, can we have it now? And it's a bit too late. And that's sort of exactly what's happened in the first pilot program at Energy Sprong in Nottingham, where you've got a row of 8, 9, 10 homes, and 2 of them haven't been done. And I think in the first case, one of them, who's a landlord's own property, private landlord, after he'd seen what had happened and the great deal that he would have got, he kind of wanted it after that. Okay. So I think the more examples that you can have of good retrofits, the more likely those community approaches will likely to work, because people will be aware that it's something that's worth doing.
Yeah. Cool. Go on, Martin. Yeah.
And I think optimistically, the more the story of missing out gets publicised and shared, the more people are likely to grasp hold of that. And certainly, coming back to the philosophy behind Phil's point, there'll be a lot of other community benefits, not simply in the fact that they've organised retrofit, in terms of, because it's implicit in the question that there are frictions between those 2 communities within that area. So if you can make the one community as part of this, then that has to be a good thing for social landlords to be doing as well.
Yep. Andrew, just before we move on,
yeah, just one last point. I think a lot of people's misconceptions around things as well, like particularly around EWI, that they've seen a project years ago and thought, that doesn't look so great. When they actually see something in the local area that's been done recently and it's been done to a really good standard, they go, wow, that would really make my property look so much better. I think we need to bring people's knowledge up to date on what's possible now and what the outcomes are, and bring them along for the ride, really.
Absolutely. So last couple of minutes, Phil, Michael is asking you to share some examples of where the sequencing of work, so you talked about where that's caused some issues.
All right. Well, there's a number that immediately spring to mind. People that have, or maybe individuals or landlords that have improved the building services before the fabric, and you can set up clashes with that, because you've improved your heat sources, but there are optimum performances of heat. When I say boilers spans across a whole range of things. It's not just what you might consider to be a gas boiler, it's sort of heat sources in general, but they need to be sized to the property to get maximum efficiency. Now, I know there's a sort of fairly wide concept in industry that everything modulates and sets its own levels, but heat sources are designed to meet the demand of the house. So if they're undersized, they work too hard. If they're oversized, there's every potential that they don't work at maximum demand. There's other more sort of simplistic examples that I can think of exterior wall insulation being put on a dwelling before windows can be changed. So then the window contractor follows around several weeks, months, or years later, and then there's potential probably actual disturbance of the EWI that needs remediation. That probably a lesser factor. It depends how it's remediated as to how attractive it is, and what we're talking about is the functionality rather than how aesthetically pleasing it looks. But there's also the risk of invalidating guarantees, which could be fairly substantial on EWI if problems occur later on that may not necessarily be linked to the exchange of the windows, but it's got a knock-on effect. So they're fairly simple examples of it, but they're things that are fairly obvious. And the more you think about it, the more conflicts that you can set in the orders of doing it. And that's why I think I mean, there are professional people listening to this as well as people on the panel that understand it. But getting things out of sequence, not only risk detriment, but it just adds expense.
Yeah, and that's kind of where a retrofit coordinator can come in, isn't it, Phil? Under PAS 2035, building a plan for the property, they consider all of those things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Absolutely. George, go on.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'd really like to see a company develop a good quality insulated demountable window reveal to go with EWI, so you can avoid that situation. Because I think for social landlords, if you just put windows in, they've got 20 years life, you don't want to change them. So that would really help things.
Yeah, and look, we're sort of just coming up to out of time. The next question is will you be able to see this talk available for reference? And the answer is, of course, yes, you can, both on our Elemental YouTube channel and the website, and we'll put up links for that. There are a bunch more questions. I'm sure we could keep going probably for another hour, and I'm sure our panel would be happy to. But what we'll do is we will take those questions and we'll try and get answers back to you after the session, as well as sharing out the link to the recording when it is available. So I do just want to thank everyone for listening in today, for joining, for taking an hour of your time, and also a huge thank you to our panel for their time and for sharing their insights. So Andrew, Martin, George, Andy, and Phil, very big thank you to all of you, and hopefully see you again very soon.
Thank you for the invite.
Great.
Ben,
Thanks, Ben.
for the opportunity.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.
Super.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.